Thank you, and thank you for inviting me as well. This is a great conference, and I'm really impressed with the range and the quality of papers that are being presented here. So hopefully this session can help you think a little bit more about active learning, and in particular what I'm going to be trying to talk about is not just how we might go about engaging in active learning and some of the things that we can all think about, but also trying to think about what barriers there are to active learning and how we can actually go about solving those. So, as a preview, there's a wide background in why there might be difficulties and why there might be reluctance to engage in active learning. And these barriers might exist both within academic colleagues, within institutional frameworks, within students who are trying to engage with that learning. One of the perceived barriers in terms of gaining a program level approach to active learning is effectively inertia with colleagues. A lot of colleagues may have been educated through a very leader-follower method of teaching, where you have an informed professor delivering information to students who diligently write down what's said and reproduce that and engage and go a bit further. But that sort of approach doesn't necessarily lend itself to active learning. And just because it's worked historically to create new professors doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to work for everyone. As education has been more and more marketized, this is particularly true in the United Kingdom, we're also getting a lot of reluctance from students. Students want to know how they can get a good grade. How can they get their highest grade for the assessment? That doesn't necessarily lend itself to active learning, in that students really want to be told what's the answer, how do we get the answer, how can we practice getting to the answer. So that's almost an aspect of the marketization of higher education that's creating barriers towards active learning. Similarly, students may have inappropriate time preferences. I'll talk about this a little bit later, but we know that all of us will try and delay things that might be hard work until later on. This is particularly true with students, and the time preferences of students, even if activities will help them improve their grades today, it may be that they're reluctant to do it today if there are other opportunities. In terms of institutional frameworks, there's the design of space, the appropriate technology being available. These are all potential barriers that can make it more difficult for us to engage with active learning. Now, before I start thinking about what those barriers are, let's just think about what active learning actually helps us to do. So Bloom's revised taxonomy provides us with a taxonomy of learning. And we can think about the foundations of learning as being remembering and basic understanding. And remembering and basic understanding are the sorts of things that can be achieved through passive learning. If you're passively engaging with material, you might be able to remember it. You might even be able to understand it. But what you might not be able to do is go into the higher levels of learning. The higher levels of learning, things about application, things about analysis, things about synthesis, evaluation, and creation, they're going to be much more difficult to do without engaging in some form of active learning. We can very much remember and understand what's being told to us in lectures. That may or may not be true, but we can at least make a start at it. If it's a simple delivery lecture, we might be able to remember, we might be able to understand. But how about applying those concepts? Well, in order to apply the concepts, you actually need to practice applying those concepts. In order to gain analysis, you're going to need to actively engage with the material to analyze that material. Evaluation and synthesis. You're going to benefit from discussing ideas with your peers. You're going to benefit from being able to think about the ideas, analyze them, actively engage with those materials. Creation, again, you're going to need to have actively engaged with material in order to be able to create new ideas. So all of these higher levels of learning, in order to achieve those, you really need to have active engagement with the material. Now, why might we have reluctance towards active learning? Well, university education has looked very similar for hundreds and hundreds of years. This illustration is actually an illustration of a university class from the University of Bologna in the 1350s. And there are a lot of characteristics which we might recognise today. Students are sat in rows. We've got students with books that they're trying to write into. There's some of the students who may or may not be engaging. For instance, this gentleman here, there's individuals chatting with each other. It's not necessarily that everyone's engaging, but a question we might think about is, why might universities look like this? What might have driven universities to end up looking like this? Well, we can think about the background in which universities initially evolved. Universities were very much about transmitting knowledge. Educated and informed professors would be able to transmit their knowledge to uninformed students. So what might this look like? Well, or why might we need to do this? Well, one of the key technologies that's also helpful in transmitting knowledge is the book. And if we look at book production over time, in the 6th century in Great Britain, a grand total of 81 books were published. In the 7th century, it increased to 1,000, and over time that's been increasing. But the thing that really made the difference in terms of transmission of knowledge through books was the creation of the printing press. The printing press allowed a step change in the creation of books in order to allow us to transmit knowledge. We can see that not only in Great Britain, but also across Europe as well. In the 15th century, when the printing press was invented, suddenly we had a step change in the production of books. Now, why is this important when it comes to thinking about the structure of higher education? Well, before the introduction of the printing press, the verbal record was one of the few ways in which you could transmit knowledge from in an informed instructor to an uninformed set of students. So the university structure was about transmitting that knowledge in order for individuals to be able to annotate and make their own notes and to learn the material themselves. But since the invention of the printing press, the motivation and the need for these simple delivery lectures, the simple delivery of education, has changed. And we need to think a little bit more about what the purpose of education is. Now, we know from the existing literature that active learning has significant positive impacts on student outcomes. Now, we can think about active learning in a constructivist viewpoint. Constructivism thinks about how when you're constructing knowledge, you need to link it to a student or to a learner's existing knowledge. So how does active learning help us here? Well, what active learning does is it allows us to effectively connect the knowledge that students are trying to learn with their existing knowledge base. by creating activities, by getting students to discuss ideas, that you are explicitly getting them to connect the ideas together with what they already know. The active learning that we design is there to try and provide the scaffolding to allow those students to make those individual connections. And there's a wide range of literature that finds benefits of active learning. So for instance, Mitchell et al., they find significant advantages, significant benefits to students from active learning compared with passive learning. Now, what sort of shapes could active learning take? Now, I have from this conference looked at where you've been identifying active learning in your own education, and there's a whole range of areas. So we could be having gamification of education. Flipped classrooms are often used as a form of active learning, problem-based learning, think, pair, share strategies, peer feedback. All of these are routes into engaging with active learning. But each of these have barriers that we need to think about how we overcome, how we get students to engage with it, how we manage to engage with this within the classroom. So, let's think about the first barrier that I'm going to talk about. Now, the first real barrier is actually fundamental in the design of universities. The design of the space that we have available to us is going to be a clear influencer on how we go about teaching and how we can go about teaching. So, what do I mean? Well, this sort of lecture theatre may well look familiar to many of us. The banks of fixed seating pointing forwards towards a blackboard or a whiteboard or a projector screen. These kind of lecture theatres are very much seen across the world in universities. It's the popular image of what a university looks like, but actually this sort of space may not be ideal to gaining good active learning strategies. First of all, what we can see straight away is that everyone's focus is forward. Everyone is focusing forward towards a board. What this immediately lends itself to is it lends itself towards a presenter-listener viewpoint. It doesn't lend itself towards active engagement. So in these sorts of spaces, we need to think about how we can try and take advantage of active learning strategies. If we're faced with a lecture theatre like this and we want to engage in active learning, it's perfectly possible, but the design of the space does begin to push you into particular strategies. Now, I think that it's worth thinking about the 1350s again and what lecture theatres look like today, and not much has really changed. The design of the lecture theatre today is still being influenced by the design of the lecture theatre 600, 700, 800 years ago. So it's not surprising that pedagogy doesn't necessarily change when the design of the lecture theatre is pushing people towards particular methods of delivery. The tiered lecture theatre, where you've got students looking at you as a lecturer, looking at you as a deliverer, looking at you as a professor, that's immediately going to drive the pedagogy potentially towards a very traditional form of delivery. The delivery of a sage on the stage, delivering knowledge to a set of uninformed students. Now, we don't have to accept this as we don't have to accept this, we don't have to take this on face value. So what's the key problem that we run into? Well, the key problem is that the structure of the teaching space can actually end up influencing the structure of the pedagogy. So the structure of the way that we teach can be influenced by the space that we're thinking about teaching in. If we're in a tiered lecture theatre where everyone's looking forward, then that's going to push individual educators towards a particular manner of delivery where we're thinking about speaking to an audience rather than thinking about engagement as a whole. Now, the other problem of this is that if the structure of the teaching space is shaping the pedagogy, well, when you've got university designers thinking, well, we want to design a new teaching space, what will that teaching space look like? Well, we'll think about what the pedagogy looks like. We'll think about the fact that actually lectures occur with people standing on a stage, speaking to their audience. The structure of the pedagogy itself then reinforces the structure of the teaching space. So this barrier, it creates a destructive loop. We end up with a pedagogy which is less effective, but it's driving the shape of the teaching space. So what we need to do as educators, if we're wanting to try and create this active learning space, is we almost need to have this, we need to create a shock. We need to create the shock by introducing and demonstrating the benefits of the new pedagogy. Ideally, we need to be demonstrating to senior members of universities who are working with designers of teaching space to really make it clear that new pedagogies are not suitable for the old space. Now, we aren't purely looking at, or space is not purely designed in this way. There's a growing literature and there's a growing set of designs of active learning spaces, of spaces which are designed precisely for active learning. So what might those sorts of spaces look like? Well, there's a range of spaces. This is actually Leeds University Business School in the UK, which are beginning to think about how you can bring students together so that the design of a lecture theatre is not about an audience facing you, but it's about groups within the auditorium who are able to work together, who are able to engage in appropriate technology, who are able to engage with each other, to engage in active learning. And the design of the space itself creates a different dynamic. It creates the dynamic of group work rather than just an individual being spoken or an individual speaking to you. Now, obviously this is the sort of thing that can't be done overnight, but by engaging in the activities of think, pair, shared, by engaging in group work within those less appropriate lecture spaces, by getting individuals to work together, it can help provide the incentive to move towards more collaborative space which is potentially more flexible, space which helps shape the pedagogy. Now, there's a wide range of literature, as I say, that looks at the impact of collaborative spaces in large group teaching. And the general messages of the literature is that the shape of the teaching space genuinely influences the interactions within that space. It influences the way that the educator and the students engage with each other. It also influences the way that students learn. Students tend to learn better in these kind of active learning environments rather than in the traditional auditorium all facing forward. Now, if you are engaged in thinking about teaching space, there's an excellent set of principles set out in Finkelstein et al. And the key elements of thinking about how you can go about designing new teaching space is, first of all, predicated on developing methods to enable active learning. Now, that active learning may well require appropriate technology. So if you're in a lecture theatre, the appropriate technology in order to engage, get students to engage to get students to think about how they're going to engage with the material during the lecture, during the small group class, during the seminar that you're running. Often that technology needs to be present from the start. Now that might be in the form of simple audience response technology. It might be in the form of computer screens that you can share ideas on, and that you can share with the overall plenary session. But the technology itself is going to be really important. Secondly, it's really important in these kinds of new teaching spaces to enable active learning, that students can engage with their peers. Peer learning, peer discussion, peer evaluation, peer explanation are incredibly powerful tools to enable students to learn and develop their understanding. Similarly, there needs to be mechanisms within those teaching spaces for students to engage with the educators, to engage with the faculty. And in a large space, those can be difficult, but there are, again, a range of activities, a range of technology that can be used that can help with that process. In the lecture theatres that we see here, each of the little sub areas have microphones associated with them, so that each individual island of students can speak directly to the entire class. They can all be microphoned up. That allows for much greater engagement across the entire group. It allows for large group teaching to become truly active and interactive. Now, this is a set of principles that might be useful in large group sessions, but they're also useful in smaller group sessions. Quite often, learning facilities management within universities will set up teaching spaces, even in relatively small spaces, in rows of students, so the students are all just looking at an educator at a whiteboard at the front. Those sorts of spaces are not particularly conducive to gaining the active learning, to gaining good engagement. So a simple step in order to try and break those barriers is just simply to rearrange a classroom whenever you start a teaching session. Now, the second barrier I'd like to talk about a little bit is about barriers that we inadvertently design ourselves. Now, a key barrier to gaining students engaging with active learning is actually making that active learning relevant for the students. So, what do I mean there? Well, I'm going to start with a couple of key observations. The first key observation is that students are quite often, not always, but quite often, are assessment driven. Students' activities, students' learning is very much influenced by assessment. And what I've got here as a graph is showing students' engagement with videos through a teaching term. So these are videos of learning materials, and this unit was being assessed through an exam, a single terminal exam at the end of the unit. Initially, there's a reasonably strong uptake in the videos at the beginning of the teaching period. Then there's very little engagement within it, and suddenly we get a spike of students engaging with the learning material towards the end, just before the exam. So what students are doing there is they're trying to engage with material in a way to try and help influence their performance in the exam. Now, one of the ways that we can actually incentivize and create mechanisms to get students to engage with active learning is by thinking about the assessment that we provide to students. If assessment is designed in such a way that students can simply learn and memorize and remember content, so remember, thinking back to those base layers of Bloom's taxonomy, if all that we're doing is we're assessing, understanding and remembering, Well, there's no incentive for students to engage with active learning. Active learning is not necessarily going to help them. Now, most economics exams don't look like just simple understanding and remembering. We want students to be able to evaluate. We want students to be able to create new ideas, to be able to solve new problems. And the design of the assessment that we give to students can genuinely help to get students thinking about active learning. So, what might that look like? Well, Holmes recommends looking at continuous assessment. So, one route towards getting students actively engaging might be to have continuous assessment methods. So, these were talked about briefly in the last session. The idea that we might have assessments structured throughout the year to provide incentives for students to engage. Now, this in itself may not lead to active learning per se. It might just lead to timely learning. But what it might do, what we might need to think about is how can we design the assessment in such a way that active learning is genuinely going to be beneficial. So how do we get students attempting problems, engaging with learning through those problems to help develop their understanding? Well, the continuous assessment might help there because you're providing an incentive for the students to engage with the material, but the continuous assessment needs to then feed in to later assessments. It needs to be that it's not a standalone activity, that it goes on and feeds into the later activities, that the activity that a student does today will feed into the activity that they do next week and maybe the activity that they do in 10 weeks' time. So that effectively creates a structure where active learning becomes a virtuous circle. Now, it's important to think about this in the environment of constructive alignment. Now, when we think about assessment is there to assess learning outcomes for a unit or for a program or for a course. Similarly, we design teaching and learning activities to help students develop those learning outcomes. But in terms of constructive alignment, we need to think about how all of these three things interact. If students know that they can do well in an exam simply through memorization, if they can simply memorize a set of problems or even just pattern recognition. So in maths problems, it's not uncommon for students to not learn the fundamentals of calculus, but instead recognize how to solve problems. That might help them if they're seeing familiar problems, but it won't help them later down the line when they're trying to think creatively or think about unfamiliar problems. The design of the assessment itself needs to be in such a way to incentivize and create benefits to students from active learning activities, which, as we know, help students gain those deeper learning of the material. So we as educators really need to think about how we design the assessment in such a way to make sure that the teaching and learning activities that we want students to engage with, that are going to be beneficial for students, are genuinely engaged with. So, coming back to the beginning where I started talking about the general themes of active learning. Now, what other forms of active learning is there? Well, we've already talked quite a lot today about flipped classrooms, and there's a wide range of evidence of the benefits of flipped classrooms. Some of the evidence is less good than others. Within the literature, there's a lot of selection goes on, that flipped classrooms are not necessarily applied experimentally. There may well be selection bias in a lot of the papers, but generally speaking, the main message of the literature is that flipped classrooms have a significant positive effect on students' learning. Now, we might want to think a little bit about what a flipped classroom looks like. So the structure of flipped classrooms that we're probably most used to is the idea that we'll have a preparation stage where we get students doing something asynchronously. So they do something outside of class, which is a preparation activity, which within the flipped literature is usually watching a video or engaging with a video or engaging with something digital so that they can begin their learning of the material. Stage 2, there's usually a reinforcement stage where students are reinforcing their understanding, their knowledge of the material that's being delivered in that preparation stage. And stage 3 is where there's an applied or an active engagement with the material within a teaching session. And this active engagement might be in the form of discussion, it might be in the form of problem solving, it might be in the form of active problem-based evaluation, but this is the general shape of the flipped classroom within the literature. Now, sometimes step 2 is missed out. Step 2 is usually a really useful stage just to try and create incentives for students to engage with step 1. Flipped classrooms fail when students haven't engaged with the preparation. So the flipped classroom itself, there are barriers to getting the flipped classroom to work, and that is when the students haven't engaged with that preparation. Now, these barriers are relatively straightforward to break, in that by having, by creating a commitment device, by creating the reinforcement, or just making it very, very clear early on in the educational experience that if students haven't done the preparation material, it will be almost impossible for them to engage in the more advanced material that they see within the live session, then this creates that commitment device for students to engage in it. Now, what I'm going to say might sound a little bit controversial, and that is that there's nothing new about a flipped classroom. Flipped methodologies are not particularly new, but we are needing to think about how we get students to engage with them. The literature on the flipped classroom is all about thinking about the digital preview, the digital initial stage, but very traditional methods of learning were about getting students to do some reading before a class. They start off with doing the reading as the preparatory material. You might even give students a bit of work to do based on that reading. And then based on the reading, based on the work that they've done based on that reading, you then run a live session where you're providing support to students to build on those initial foundations. So the flipped classroom itself is nothing particularly new. What we're doing differently now is we're trying to think about other methods of learning other than just through simple reading. Now, there are some now debunked popular theories about learning styles. So in the early 21st century, learning styles were very, very popular in the educational literature. People would talk about learners being visual learners or auditory learners or kinesthetic learners. And visual learners might learn through reading. Another adaptation of this would be the VARK, the visual, auditory, reading and kinesthetic model. And visual or reading learners would primarily learn through reading, and auditory learners would primarily learn through listening, and kinesthetic learners would primarily learn through doing. But actually, this sort of model is a really, really bad model of how people learn. People learn through mixed methods. They learn partly through reading material. They learn partly through engaging, listening, and evaluating material. They learn partly through doing and actively engaging with the material. But the key theme around all of this is getting students actively engaged with the material. So the thing I would say about the flipped classroom is there are some very powerful things that you can do with a flipped classroom, but they don't necessarily need to involve lots and lots of videos, preparation, digital material. You can go and get students simply to engage with reading. Get students to read ideas, read passages, read parts of textbooks. That, in a way, is part of the flipped learning. Where we can create the incentive to do that is creating those commitment devices. Creating the commitment device to ensure that students have engaged with that material before they start their learning journey. And again, in a very traditional method of education, in the lecturer delivering material being new to students, that's where students gain the understanding and remembering. Now, in a traditional model of education where a lecturer delivers material and then sends students out to do harder material, well, it's not surprising that some students struggle. Applying, analysis, evaluation, creation, synthesis are difficult things for students to do. And that's why the flip, that's why thinking about getting students doing the easy material before the class, then engaging with more advanced, more active material during the class, that's why the flipped classroom works. So, one thing I would say is there are potential barriers even within the flipped classroom. And one of the barriers is often thought to be that when you're giving that preparation material, if you're delivering the material for the first time and you're delivering it live to students, you can gauge how the students are engaging with it. You can gauge whether or not you need to go over material again. You can gauge whether or not students are understanding what you're talking about. If that preparation material is asynchronous, there is the worry that what's going to end up happening is that some students will just not be able to engage with the material. The reason that they might not come to class with the preparation material understood is simply because they find the material too difficult. And that preparation material, it can create potential barriers towards the flipped classroom working. Now, there is some research on whether or not the flipped classroom does have heterogeneous effects. And Balaban et al. Have a really nice paper which looks at differences in the benefits of the flipped classroom depending on where people are within the ability or the attainment distribution. And what they find is that students in the top 25% of the distribution benefit more from a flipped classroom than those in the bottom 25%, but everyone still gains a significant advantage. So the flipped classroom itself, it does create differential effects that those who are at the highest level of attainment are going to gain the most benefit. But with a well-designed flipped classroom, thinking about how you design that preparation material, whether it's reading, whether it's videos, whether it's other forms of digital material, students still benefit. Now, in terms of my work with flipped classrooms, I've been working with flipped classrooms for about 10 years now. And I've taken a slightly different approach to flipped classrooms than many have within the literature, in that rather than flipping my large group sessions, I end up flipping all of my small group sessions with students. So in a very traditional educational environment, what happens in the UK quite often in economics is that students will be introduced to material in a lecture, they'll then be given some homework, and then that homework will be discussed in a small group seminar. And that's a fairly familiar form of education for many of our peers. Where the model I use is slightly different is that, yes, students see material to prepare ahead of classes, but rather than discussing it in a class, the students have already done it, just provide some solutions. I provide video solutions, I provide written solutions for students to engage with, to check their understanding. So we have a first stage where students are actively engaging in effectively problem-based learning. They're trying to develop their learning through relatively straightforward problems for them to solve. Solutions are made available, and final answers are made available for the students to check their understanding. If they find that they haven't managed to get to an overall correct answer or an overall correct discussion, then the solution can guide them towards those final ideas. Within the class, we then introduce new problems that students can work on in groups. So again, developing problem-based learning within the classroom. The students work in groups and then they're supported by the class tutor. Now, it's very difficult to try and evaluate whether or not this has a positive or negative impact on grades, but what we can look at is who these sorts of sessions were beneficial for and who preferred them. And the key thing is that the students who ended up preferring these flipped classrooms were the students who had engaged with all of that preparatory material. The students who had engaged with the preparatory materials seemed to be the students who were most likely to prefer that flipped material. Now, more and more we're thinking about learning within the online space. And this does raise a few questions about how we go about designing material in terms of videos or material in terms of digital elements for students to engage with. And there is a range of literature that looks at students' attention within videos and within material in the online space. One of the key messages is that if all you do is you replicate a delivery session, so you replicate a educator speaking to a group of students in a video medium, and it just lasts 50 minutes, for instance, then there's no reason that students are going to understand or engage with that material any better than they would in a lecture theatre. The only advantage is that if students get lost, they can rewind the video. There's evidence from, for instance, Risco et al., who find strong evidence of students' minds wandering in the second half compared with the first half of lectures. Students' performance in even simple memory tests were lower in the second half of lectures compared with the first half of digital lectures. So, in order to try and make these kind of online learning activities in the online space to be beneficial for students, again, we need to think about how we can get the active learning engaged. So Spooner et al. Have a really nice paper where they actually actively, experimentally introduce interpolated tests. They introduce tests within the videos so that students, after they've watched a small chunk of online video, they have to have a small test, then another small chunk of video, and then another small test. They're creating active engagement even within the online video space. And those who received the test, those who had those interpolated tests, who effectively were forcing the students to engage in active learning, those students were performing better in final tests than students who didn't have those interpolated tests. So the design of material that we put into the online space when we're thinking about flipping or when we're thinking about teaching online really, really matters. Now, what other mechanisms are there in the online space? Well, one of the mechanisms that is becoming more and more widely used is the use of message boards. Message boards are really important because, particularly when you've got very large cohorts of students, you as an educator don't particularly want to be receiving an email every 5 minutes from a student answering questions. But what a message board can do is it can give you the opportunity to have a question answered once, but also get students to actively engage in answering questions themselves. So I evaluated this a few years ago using the Piazza message board system. And within an entire year set of units, so this was across the first and second semester in mathematics and statistical methods, we introduced a message board in the second semester. And sign up to this message board was voluntary. We had effectively two different forms of treatment that were going on. In the statistics half of the course, the instructor provided full answers to any of the questions that students asked. In the mathematics side of the course, the instructors weren't providing any guidance on answers to mathematical questions, but students themselves were answering questions to each other. And even within the treatment, even within the students who signed up for the message board, there's two types of students. There's students who actively engage with the message board, so they ask or answer questions. And then there are students who just passively watch the message board. They see some messages coming in, they see the answers, they think that that's going to be sufficient to be able to improve their grade. Now, let's see what the impact of these message boards were. So this sort of introduction lends itself to a difference in difference analysis. And what we found was that by introducing the message boards, students who signed up performed almost 3 percentage points higher in mathematics, but something strange happened in statistics, and they were about 2.4 percentage points lower in their statistics. Now, you might think, well, maybe this is selection, maybe it's just that students are selecting into this who are better at maths or they're worse at statistics. So in order to check this, I did carry out a dummy difference in difference using a set of units that these students were sitting contemporaneously, which didn't have any message board software, and found absolutely zero effect. So we've got some curious effects going on. We're finding that students are performing better in maths, where remember that message boards are active, the students can ask and answer questions to each other, but they're not having any instructor involvement. And in stats, students seem to, certainly at the 10% significance level, perform worse. So what's driving these effects? Well, what we could do is we could break down the students into a passive group, so the students who are just sitting and watching, who have signed up for the message boards, but aren't actually asking or answering questions, but are still engaging and reading the questions and answers. And here we see a significant negative impact on their statistics score. Now, there is a positive impact on maths, where remember, the students are answering questions to each other, but where the answers were all provided by the instructor, these students, the passive students, are performing significantly worse. If we compare this with the active group, well, the active group, students who are actively asking and answering questions, are performing 4.4 percentage points higher than those students who haven't signed up for the message boards. And those students who are in statistics are not being significantly impacted. So straight away, this is more evidence that active learning has significant benefit. By looking at the students who are actively engaging with these message boards, we're seeing significant benefits for those students in their final assessment. Now, this last year and a half has created a number of fundamental challenges to thinking about active learning. And the COVID pandemic has created a real shock to education. In March 2020, almost immediately, almost all of UK education and education across much of the world moved from the face-to-face environment to the online environment. And this does create a number of challenges to gaining active learning. Now, there are some fundamental challenges. The first fundamental challenge is that there is heterogeneous access to fast internet. In the experience that I've been developing with with students even who are very close to the university, because those university facilities weren't necessarily open, they were all accessing through their home internet. And student residences don't all necessarily have the same access to fast internet. Similarly, students in live sessions maybe have heterogeneous willingness to share their home space. There's a lot of inequality between students, and students from various backgrounds may be less willing to share their home space and feel that the classroom's invading their home space than students from other backgrounds. Similarly, if you're teaching live sessions, it might be difficult for you to monitor student engagement. So in a live environment, you can set students a problem to do, you can get them thinking about how they're going to actively engage in a problem, you can put them into groups to discuss it, you can walk around the room very easily to see how they're engaging. But in the online space, that's a bit more difficult. If you're thinking about getting students to do a problem, well, how do you know in a Zoom session whether or not the blank screen that you're seeing from a student is the student sitting, listening, engaging with the material, or that they've gone off to go and have their lunch? So it creates these other challenges. So what can we think about as solutions in the online space? Well, we've talked about online message boards. Flipped classrooms also can work in the online space, but you do need to think about how you're going to get students to engage with those activities. Now, one of the further significant challenges in the online space is thinking about technological issues. Now, an awful lot of students don't have input devices which allow them to translate handwriting directly into a digital form. So when we're thinking about getting students doing mathematics together or solving problems together, we need to think about different solutions to how we can get engagement within those classrooms. There are a number of routes that we could use. So simple routes might be if you get students to do a problem together, you can get them to take photos of their attempts and share them with each other. That's one route. Another route is to rethink how you go about getting students to do problems in a class. So often with problem-based, with mathematically based problems, students might learn techniques, might be able to replicate techniques, but may not be able to explain why they're doing what they're doing. So a powerful technique, even in the face-to-face environment, but especially in the online environment, is to get students to explain concepts, to explain how they would go about approaching a problem to their peers, and also why they might go about doing that. Now, that does create a starting point. You get the students to think about how they're going to engage with that material. You get the students to think about what steps they're going to take. And then you can draw the students back together to think about a plenary session, to think about giving the students the opportunity to then share their understanding with you, to share their how they would go about solving it. And you can use technology in order to share the mathematics as well. Now, there are other opportunities. There are a lot of asynchronous opportunities to get students actively engaged in thinking about mathematics. A wide and a growing range of message boards have LaTeX embedded within them. I've done a lot of work with message boards over the years, and what I have found is that students are much less willing to engage with message boards which feel part of the educational establishment. So my institution uses Blackboard as its key online learning environment. And Blackboard has a message board which has an equation editor that students can ask mathematical problems. You can get students solving mathematical problems together. It's not great on the LaTeX editor, but it does the job. students' engagement with those Blackboard message boards is virtually zero. Students need really strong encouragement to engage with those Blackboard message boards. Now, by introducing an external message board, initially I introduced Piazza, but now I use EdStem, this actually transformed engagement. Suddenly, rather than having 1 or 2 questions per term, I have multiple questions coming in every day. And this creates transformative engagement with the material. Now, there are reasons why students might be more willing to engage with these external provided message boards. First of all, there's more anonymity in an externally provided space. If students feel that the message boards are being linked to their learning environment, they might worry that it's going to be linked to their grade by putting what they might consider a silly question might have an influence on the grade that they get. However wrong they might be about that belief, it still persists. So by having an external message board, it creates more of a safe space. Similarly, by having a message board where students are anonymous to their peers, it creates the opportunity that they don't lose face if they ask a question that their peers might think is obvious. So there's a wide range of evidence that anonymity helps remove inhibitions. It allows students to ask the questions that they wouldn't normally ask, simply because it allows them the opportunity to feel that the space is safe. There is a flip side to that, and that is that if students are too anonymous, they might be disrespectful within that space, but actually that's often quite a small risk. And a lot of the external providers will also allow for students to be anonymous to each other, but not anonymous to the instructor. So these platforms do allow for much more engagement. Now, I'm aware that I'm coming close to the end of my time, but I just want to briefly talk a little bit more about engagement with online videos. And thinking about how online videos in a blended space or in a flipped space are engaged with by students when you're providing the incentives for active learning. So in a final year undergraduate unit, I introduced a very flipped, very blended environment. So what students were given is that before, this is in response to the COVID pandemic, before students had any live sessions, they had a number of recorded activities for them to engage with. Some of these recorded activities had interpolated questions, some of them had problems for them to engage with, some of them had message board requirements to ask and answer questions to each other. But the question that we might ask is, how does this shape when students engage with the material? Well, we had 3 recorded videos in this example that were run before the live lecture. Most of the students on this unit chose this topic to write essays about. And when did students engage with the material? Well, the first recorded video they engage with sometime before the 29th of October. Second recorded video, engagement looks very similar. Third recorded video looks very similar. And what's going on here is that students are all engaging with this material before the live lecture takes place. Because there's an incentive placed for them, they know that in order to engage with the live material, they're going to need to know the material in this recorded sessions. Because of that incentive, they begin to engage with the material at the time when we hope that they're going to. It creates that initial active engagement. I then, after the live session had taken place, released a video of the live session, and students do watch it after the live session has taken place. But when we look at what students are actually watching, it isn't that the students are re-watching the whole of the live video, it's that they are actively picking up appropriate parts of that live session. The students are focusing on the last third of the live session. They're focusing on this in part because there was difficult material in there. So the students themselves are choosing what to engage with and choosing when to re-engage with that material. So students are themselves being smart with their engagement. They're actively thinking about what's useful for their engagement. But the move to the online space does need new tools. We can't just rely on all of the tools that we've previously used. Because of the heterogeneity, because of the differences in the student backgrounds, because of the differences in students' resources, we need to think about a range of activities, a range of technologies that allow students to engage both synchronously with each other and asynchronously. So there are tools that you can engage with that are obvious for asynchronous work, such as creating packages with learning activities embedded with them. So H5P is a lovely piece of software just for developing embedded active learning activities. But there are other opportunities such as Padlet or discussion boards in order to get students to engage asynchronously with each other, to ask and answer questions, to pose ideas, to share ideas with each other. All of these are great technologies to enable students to think about sharing those ideas. Now, I've come to the end of my talk now, and just to sum up where we began, there are a wide range of barriers to having active learning, but none of these are terminal barriers. None of those actually stop us engaging with active learning. Even when space is designed in such a way that it might push people towards passive learning, we need to break those barriers. We need to get students working with each other. We need to think about active ways to infiltrate the space with active learning. We need to think about how we design our assessment to incentivize and to create the environment that students need to create good active learning. We need to think about what technology we need, what technology we can use in order to create good active learning environments. Thank you very much.